Hello. I want to begin by just thanking you all for inviting me to give this talk. As suggested in the introduction, I spend a lot of time thinking about critical thinking, thinking about how to teach it well, and especially because I see critical thinking as a skill. Just like people aren't born being able to do karate or play electric guitar, I don't think they're born with the ability to think critically. It's something they learn by doing, and preferably by doing it in a repeated, structured environment. So I want to give you a little bit of that story, and then with that as background, we're going to think critically about research ethics and especially about animal research. So, first of all, let me just begin by defending that claim that critical thinking is not natural. When we look at the brain and the brain development, both in terms of evolution and in terms of lifespan, what we see is that the parts of the brain that are critical for thinking rationally are in fact the last ones to develop. So, from an evolutionary perspective, all the parts of our brain that make decisions based on emotions and quick reactions, they've been there for a long, long time. And we share those parts of the brain with just about every animal that exists. So they're very, ancient, well-developed systems that have a very dominant role to play in keeping us alive, essentially. The neocortex, the part that does the logic and reasoning, is the most recently evolved. And in fact, even if we look at a child developing, we see the same pattern repeat during a lifespan development, that the parts of the brain, things like the hippocampus that support conscious memory, and of course the frontal lobes and the cortex in general, they are the latest to come online. And what this means is that the learning that the learning that children are doing early in their life, is in fact not governed by critical thinking and rational thought. So, what is it governed by then? Well, a lot of research in psychology suggests that there are two very powerful forces that are at play for the child's developing mind. Albert Bandura is very well known for all of his work showing the power of what he calls observational learning, which is a very simple concept, really. It just suggests that children learn a lot of their behaviors and even their opinions by basically adopting those from people around them. So things they see, stuff that their parents do, and so we've all seen those images, for example, of a little boy, pretending to shave along with his father, or maybe a little girl who's putting on makeup or pretend makeup along with their mother. That kind of thing, where a child is watching a parent and imitating their behaviors. And in fact, Bandura showed this is a really powerful, powerful force. And he was one of the ones that started really making us worry about things like violence in the media, that if children are seeing violence, they will in fact adopt some of those behaviors. So, based on Bandura's work, we know that this is a really powerful force in the young child's mind, and in fact, they come to emulate those around them. Now, as they become older, um, their behavior repertoire becomes more complex. And we know a lot about that from the work of B.F. Skinner. His work basically says, in a nutshell, that as we find ourselves in different social contexts, those contexts give us rewards and punishments for acting a certain way. And we now shape our behavior further to fit the context. So let me give you an example that kind of brings these together. Let's imagine a child that was raised by parents, and perhaps one or more of the parents had a tendency to swear more than they should. Of course, in the context of the household, if this is common, the child, through observational learning, will probably start to do this as well. And depending on the household, either the parents will change their behavior as they realize what's going on, or they won't care, and they will continue with their behavior. And now this child will be one who thinks that swearing is kind of okay, until perhaps they start going to school. And if they now show this behavior in a classroom setting, no doubt the teachers and other authorities within that context will give them a very different signal. They will be telling them that this is not appropriate, the child will be punished for doing this, and what the child will eventually learn to do is take what they learned from the family, but then modify it in the classroom because the reward structure is different. Okay, now, what I really want to highlight about these kinds of learning is that they're very much governed by the context a child finds itself within. In a sense, the child is learning to fit within the context. They're developing habits And the context is literally indoctrinating them. The context is letting them know what is appropriate and what is inappropriate. And it's important for me to emphasize that quite often that's perfectly reasonable, and we in fact learn a lot of useful behaviors through these processes. But there's a dark side. And as an example of the dark side, let's consider something like slavery in the time of the 1800s, for example, in America, where if you lived in the South, if you were a young white child living in the South, you would see all around you white people who owned slaves and who treated them in a very different way than they treated one another. This would be very normal for you. It would be what your parents did, and therefore, through observational learning, you would tend to do it. And even in the broader social context, if you lived in the southern part of the States, you would probably just generally be rewarded for behaving in this kind of way. So to a child in that context, they would probably never consider that there's anything wrong with owning slaves and treating them differently. Now, this is why critical thinking is so important, because sometimes habit and indoctrination can lead society en masse to accept some behavior that, when critical thinking is really applied to it, it wouldn't be considered appropriate. It wouldn't be considered rational. And so I will often argue we need to teach people to think critically, and we need to think critically ourselves so that we can, at least on occasion, reflect on some of the practices that society is engaged in. And to the extent that we ultimately decide that they are not appropriate, well, we can use that critical thinking to mount some sort of argument against it, one that we hope will have some sway. So I often, in my talks, will highlight who I call the opinion oddball. And I will say that, within each one of us, there tends to be situations where we feel our assessment of some behavior is different from those around us. And I instruct my students to embrace that difference, and in fact to use that to think, well, why does everybody else think the way they do? Why do I think differently? And is this an important enough issue that I feel I need to become an activist, that I need to speak out? So for example, if we return to the slavery days for a moment, it was at the same time of slavery when America was having a little bit of a battle with Britain. In fact, in some of the communications, they said, "We will not be your slaves" to the British, which is kind of ironic given they held slaves. But it was also this time when they developed the Declaration of Independence. And of course, the primary line of that is, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So if you're a critical thinker in the slavery days, and if you embrace that declaration, and if you say, yes, this is what we are, this is who we are as a country, this is what we believe in, then a good critical thinker will come to the realization that, but if that's what we believe in, then we cannot also embrace the practice of slavery. Those two do not fit together. And then hopefully through the construction of good arguments, one can start to present this view and maybe sway some other people's opinions. Okay, that's the role that critical thinkers have. Now, of course, it's not easy. People started making arguments against slavery decades and decades before the Emancipation. And in fact, it took a civil war to actually make it happen. Indoctrination and habits are hard things to break, but they will never be broken without the critical role of a critical thinker, an opinion oddball, coming out. All right? So, all of that is background. I now want to don the robes of the opinion oddball, and I want to get to the primary topic at hand, which is the topic of animal research. Now, you'll notice I have a cute little picture of a white rat here. When I Google animal research, there are a lot of other images that are far less cute and cuddly than this one. But I want to use that to sort of set the stage. My goal in this talk is not to use emotion. It is not to show you horrible things or to try to pull at your strings, because I know that can push you away just as well as it can influence you. I want us to stay as rational and as critical thinking as possible when approaching this issue. I will have to talk about a few issues that are a little on the edge. That's just how it goes. And there may be cases where some of you feel I am being judgmental with respect to, your day-to-day jobs, what you do. But I hope you'll understand that this is all about provoking critical thought and getting us to do that thing I talked about earlier, to step back and reflect on where we are and see what we think. Okay, so let's jump into that then. I want to give a little bit of history because I think the history is important for highlighting a point of view, a pretty extreme point of view that we can use to think against, as it were. Because in fact, a lot of the current views on animal research can be traced back to René Descartes, and especially to this concept that he forwarded called Cartesian Dualism. So let me give you my story. I kind of like this story. René Descartes was a genius, a mathematician, a scientist in general, had a major influence on Western thought in many, many ways. Like many geniuses, he also had some issues with mental disorder. He would have nervous breakdowns on a regular basis. And then one of these times, his doctor suggested that he go to France and basically have a bit of R&R, just kind of relax a little bit. So while he was doing this, he decided to visit the Royal Gardens of Saint-Germain. And because he did this intentionally, he had heard of a new innovation at these gardens, and he wanted to see it firsthand. So let me tell you the story of him encountering this innovation. He was walking around the gardens of Saint-Germain, and up ahead of him he saw a statue of Diana, goddess of the hunt. Beautiful statue, and he wanted to go and look at it more closely. As he approached, though, about halfway on his path to the statue, another statue moved from behind a bush to block his path. This was a statue of Neptune, god of the sea, with a trident bearing, and it really felt to René like Neptune had chosen to prevent him from coming any closer to the statue of Diana. Wow. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. This is the 1800s. A statue moved. At that time, statues did not move. And that's what René came to see. Now, how did the statue move? Well, this was the time when hydraulics was just being understood and being kind of turned into an engineering force that could be used. And so what had actually happened here is when René stepped forward enough, he stepped on a pressure plate that forced liquid through a thin tube, which produced enough force to propel, or propel is too strong a word, is to slightly push the statue along a relatively frictionless rail in front of his path. So the force of hydraulics, the science of hydraulics, had made this statue seem to move with intention. Now, this kind of blew René's mind. This was special effects, 18th century style. But it also got him really thinking, because until then he had kind of assumed that anytime anything moved with intention, that implied a soul, that it was only souls that caused things to move with intention. But he had just seen a statue that moved with seeming intention for mechanistic reasons. And so suddenly he started to think about humans and animals, and he started to think about their movements and what caused their movements. And he ultimately came to two different views for humans versus animals. For humans, he came to this dualistic view. He ultimately claimed the following, that our movements can come from two distinct sources. One is our own complex biological machinery. So a very mechanistic, physical approach or source of the movement, much like the statue. So he essentially said humans are part machine, and many of our movements simply reflect this complex biological machine. But he also felt that in addition to the biological machine, humans possessed a soul, and that the soul could, in essence, control the biological machine. So I have a picture here, an illustration, where he's showing this information coming in, and he'll talk about reflexes. So we can react to that information reflexively, that's the machine, or it can be passed in his case to the pineal gland, which is where he thought the soul interacted with the machine and the soul can take control. Okay, this kept him in good favor with the church, by the way, who it was very important to them that the soul still be in the picture. So for Rene Descartes, for humans, it was. But for animals, it was not. Rene felt that animals were simply complex biological machines, that they possessed no soul. And this was really important at the time, and this is where it has to get a little uncomfortable, I'm afraid. It was important at the time because this was a time of a burgeoning science where empiricism was starting to really take root, where people wanted to learn through experiments, through what they could actually see. So as Rene started talking about biological machinery, the scientists of the day wanted to understand this biological machinery. They wanted to see it in action. And this gave birth to something called vivisection. Now, obviously, you're not going to look at a human biological machine in action. If you actually have to open up the human body, that was something that was still considered sacrosanct. After all, the human body was still seen as somehow special in God's eyes, a spirit in the material world, so it were. But Rene essentially said that animals were not special. And therefore, scientists began animal research, and they began it in a relatively horrific way. They would, at times, simply nail a living animal to a board and open it up. That sounds absolutely horrific to most of us, but to Rene it didn't. And let me give you the analogy that I now use to try to make my students understand this. If we imagine a car going down the road very, very quickly, let's say 100 kilometers an hour, 150 kilometers an hour, and then suddenly the driver of that car slams on the brakes. What do you see? Well, you see the car shake and shudder and squeal and make all sorts of noises. But if I now ask you, is that car in pain? Well, most of us now would say, well, no, the car's not in pain. That's just the machinery under those forces causing those reactions. That is what Descartes said was going on with the animals. That anything that looked like pain and suffering and screaming out was in fact just this biological machinery reacting to the insult. And in fact, in what I consider a very horrific suggestion, he recommended that people begin by severing the vocal cords. Therefore, the scientist wasn't going to be exposed to so much of this noise during the procedure. Okay, so that's probably as horrific as I get, but it's important because it really highlights that view that animals are just machines, and that doing things to them is okay because they're not actually feeling anything that's being done to them. Now, I don't think most people think that way today, but there's a legacy of Rene's approach that I think does sit in a weird way that we need to think critically about. So in the current research climate, we have some clear and more or less universally accepted codes of research ethics. These have come apart through almost international bodies, not almost, international bodies, and ultimately every country with minor variations treats their human research subjects very similarly, at least every developed country. However, with animals, there's far more variability in the research code. But in virtually every context, it is fair to say that we are willing to have our animals undergo insults that we would consider unethical to have done to a human being. So these include things like otherwise unnecessary surgeries, implantations of probes or other devices, intentional exposure to diseases or viruses, AIDS, cancers, all that kind of thing. We create psychological maladies, so-called disease models. We will even go beyond diseases, and we will go to things like depression. We'll create animals that have learned to be helpless. We will create stress protocols that put them under enhanced stress. And of course, we will terminate their life quite often upon experiment completion, sometimes to verify that things were implanted where we think they were implanted, or etc. These are things we would never do to a human. So, clearly there is a double standard. I don't think that's too strong to say. I mean, it's pretty explicit. We will treat animals in ways we would consider unethical if we treated humans that way. And so that leads to sort of the two primary points. Upon what basis, if any, is this double standard justified? And if there is some justification, is this approach necessary? Is this what we have to do to reach our goals? What are our goals? Shouldn't we think about our goals, think about if it's necessary, and think about whether this approach is even wise? Okay, so with all that in mind, let's start with the justifiable. And I want to show you just a very short video clip here, but I want to give you a little bit of context. One of the things I ask my students to do is to create a short video, an argument about some issue they feel strongly about. And so their task is, within a very short period of time, to produce an argument that they hope will provoke others to think about some issue in a different way. And here's my sample that I gave to them. So let's just watch that first.
Hello. My presentation is entitled, If Only Scientists Actually Believed in Evolution Theory. Alright, here's my argument. Scientists, of course, will often espouse evolution theory as often, in a variety of ways, but primarily as the theory of how we've come to have the diversity of life we have on our planet. So it's a theory that describes how one species can change and morph and become multiple species that have very different attributes. They claim this is the correct theory and therefore one that everybody should believe, especially over other theories that perhaps can try to describe the same thing, such as, for example, creationism. Well, that would be all well and good if they really believed it. But here's my contention. A core tenet of evolution theory, and in fact, the part of it that makes it so controversial, is the claim that there's really no qualitative difference between us and all of the other animals. Yes, we may be more complex physiologically, we may be more complex behaviorally, but really the notion is that we are not qualitatively different. That is, there's not something that we have that is not present, at least to some extent, in other animals. So that's why it was so contentious, because the notion of soul, for example, becomes lost. Either we all have souls, or none of us do, but it's not something like humans are not spirits in the material world. Okay, well, if that's true, if they think that humans are not special, and there's not something different about humans, then why, when they do research, are they quite comfortable with applying different ethical principles to human work versus animal work? Specifically, why do they think it's so reasonable to do things to animals that we would never consider ethical if they were done to humans? Things like brain surgery, removing, parts of their brains, addicting them to drugs, and then taking them off drugs to see if they relapse. All of these kinds of things that if we ever did to humans, we would find horrific. And yet scientists seem to think it's perfectly okay to do these things to animals, as though there is something about animals that makes them less worthy of the same ethical standard. And that notion, that belief, runs completely counter to evolution theory, and therefore that's my argument that really scientists don't seem to believe in evolution theory, or they at least do not behave in a way consistent with those beliefs. And I just wish they did. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, I have to admit at the outset, this is actually a stolen argument. This was an argument that a student who was a creationist bent kind of student gave to me, and I found it very powerful. This whole notion that if you believe in evolution theory, you shouldn't accept the double standard in research ethics. So I've kind of repurposed it a little bit, but I think it's a powerful point, and it shows some of the complexity of the issue, but also the ambiguity of it, and the fact that most scientists don't want to wrestle with the ambiguity of it. So in the past, when I've given this talk, and I've been on this part where I've talked about whether this double standard is justified, I will spend a lot of time talking about, or I did spend a lot of time talking about research that showed things like that some animals are showing self-awareness, that a rat shows evidence of conscious memory, all these things that suggest that these intellectual abilities we pride ourselves on are in fact found in other species. But ultimately, when I do that, I always end up with this quote. And I kind of think the quote stands on its own. The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? I mean, it really gets back to that Descartes view. Do you really believe, as Descartes did, that an animal is simply a biological machine that feels nothing? Or do you actually believe that they suffer? And if they feel pain and suffering, and I think most of us believe that they do, then why will we intentionally inflict it upon them? What is the justification? And I will argue to you that in my looking at the research, there is no distinction. Nobody has highlighted any good reason that we could do something to animals that we would not have done unto ourselves. There is nothing found that suggests we are worthy of a higher ethical standard. So, I'll let that sink in for a second. We are behaving in a way that suggests there's an important difference between humans and animals, but there's no evidence that there is. And science is supposed to work on the basis of evidence, okay? Not simple belief. And even if you do believe there's a difference, there's no evidence to support it. Okay. Well, now, I want to be more realistic as well. This is a real philosophical approach. I want to compare that with another approach that I actually consider the honest answer. And this is not some authority. This is some guy that published on a website. But I think his view really kind of will make perhaps many in this room nod their head. From heart transplants, scans for improved prenatal diagnostic techniques, blood transfusions, etc. He goes on to list a whole bunch of things and ultimately says most of us have benefited from the use of animals in some way. The use of animals. Anyway, so this is Dr. Yep, he's a postdoctoral neuroscientist. I find it interesting because that he's interested in episodic memory, which is a very conscious form of memory, a very high level memory, which we see in all sorts of animals. But he is, as I think many of you are, of the notion that there is value in animal research. Value, well, let's start to be honest here. Value to us. So if we do this to them, we get things. And yes, we should try to minimize the things that we do to them, but this is the real answer of how we justify it. This is sometimes, sort of very graphically thrown in our face in ads like this. Who would you rather see live, a rat or a little girl? Here's another one. Thanks to animal research, they'll be able to protest 20.8 years longer. Ad that was out there. So these are kind of trying to capture that thing. Now, let's be honest. This is speciesism, right? This is speciesism. This is us saying our species benefits by doing this to the other species. I think we have to accept that. And even though, that argument, if you go, yeah, I'm okay with that, people are still kind of coming at you with that argument too. There's a paradox people often talk about, which is, as we do this research on animals, and especially if we're doing like animal models of diseases, we're holding this have our cake and eat it too position where we want to say, the research we do, that animal is close enough to us biologically that what we learn from them will be useful to us, but different enough on some ethically rational manner that us doing it to them is okay. It's a real fine balancing line. And, I really think, is this a paradox or is it just the case? And should we all agree that we're behaving in a very speciesist way? That we don't know. We don't know what their experience is. We don't know it's that different from ours. But we're going to do it anyway. Okay. Let me take a little bit of a jump here. And I want to relate this to child development, and specifically Piaget was a theorist in psychology who talked about the stages that children go through in their cognitive development, in their brain development. And he highlights one between 2 and 7 years old. And in fact, what I really want to highlight is this last paragraph. This is what tends to happen during the latter part of the stage, 6 or 7 years old, depending on the child. but that children in this stage are egocentric, meaning that they are only able to consider things from their own point of view and imagine that everyone else shares this view because it's the only one possible. So they see something and they think everybody sees it the way they do. But gradually during this stage, a decentering occurs. So somebody stops believing that they are the center of the world, and they're more able to imagine that something or someone else could be the center of attention. So they're getting this more global view. They're able to see the world from different perspectives, and they're more able to see that their perspective is not the perspective or even the right perspective. I want to argue to you that our behavior as scientists so far has been very egocentric, and that we need to make this translation. We need to mature. We need to move beyond using animals the way we are. And I want to now start to, imagine what that world would be like, and show you a couple of alternatives at least, and then give you a better sense of where I stand on all this. So, the first thing I think we really need to do is understand the end game. Why are we doing any of this research? What is it about? There's sort of two answers to this. One is it's about just gaining knowledge for the sake of gaining knowledge. Now, for me, that's not a very good reason for doing things to animals we consider unethical if done to ourselves. But I think more in line with what I called the real reason previously is that animal research allows us to increase the duration and quality of human life. I think if we had to nail one goal down or had to put it in a simple way, that is the goal of the research, right? To try to help our fellow human beings. Sounds like a very noble goal. And it's kind of captured into that, thanks to animal research, they'll be able to protest for 20.8 years longer. Okay. I'm gonna resist, other than just mentioning it, questioning whether this is an intelligent goal. Like, how long do we want everybody to live? Would it be a good thing if we extended human life to 200 good quality years? We're having a bit of an issue with overpopulation to begin with. So one could philosophically challenge the reasonableness of this idea. But I'm going to accept it. I'll step back from that and just accept it and say, okay, so how are we doing? How are we doing? Well, here's a graph, and I'm sorry I couldn't get a higher resolution version of it, so it's a little fuzzy, but here's a graph showing life expectancy gains over time. And when you see something like that 20.8 years, I'm assuming they're comparing something like the 1900s in a developed country to modern-ish day, and that's where they're getting their almost 30 years of life expectancy. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is this is pretty deceptive. They're attributing all that to animal research. Well, this was the time when we got to understand the importance of hygiene. So we started cleaning everything better, ourselves included, but our food, we got better water supplies, cleaner water supplies, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this embracing of hygiene was far more responsible for enhanced longevity than a lot of other things. So, it certainly is tricky to say this is all about animal research. But if you want to hold that it is, how are we doing? Well, I see that this graph goes up to 2000. And at the time, 2003, at that time, it was looking sort of okay. But more recently, there's been some worries about life expectancy and how we're all doing. And I think they highlight a really important point. So, here a study indicates that the long-running rise in life expectancy is likely to fall off, that researchers are suggesting that increases in childhood obesity will have an adverse effect on average life experience. We're seeing these huge rates of obesity all of a sudden. And that's expected to actually reduce that. In fact, we can see stories about this all the time. Stroke, diabetes, heart attack, all of which, by the way, are associated with obesity and high fat intake and high sugar intake. These are all on the rise, and they're expected to reduce life expectancy. It may reduce it by as much as 8 years, according to this study. So we're suddenly going down. Let me show you one more, and then let's jump backwards. An NIH study finds extreme obesity may shorten life expectancy by up to 14 years. So if we kind of go back here, 14 years, that's like dropping us back to levels where we were at somewhere around 1940s, 1950s. So all of the gains we made from 1940s to 1950s, maybe some of those attributed to animal research, maybe are going to be wiped out by obesity, or being wiped out by obesity. Now, for me, this really shows a really shameful irony. Where does this obesity come from? It comes from our tendency to eat high fat, high sugar food. But the high fat is mostly animals. So I mean, let's just sit back and think about this. Humans are eating animals at ridiculous rates, and doing so is causing diseases that they are now performing research on animals in hopes of curing. We caused it ourselves by using them, and now we want to cure it by using them. Well, here's one of my alternatives. Let's just stop eating so much fat and sugar. Okay? We know that if we actually did this, we could reverse some of those reductions in life expectancy by up to 14 years. So you want to have a major effect on life expectancy? If that's what it's about, then we can do a whole lot more. Rather than looking to cure the next disease, we could have a much bigger impact by focusing on prevention and maybe even legislation that does this backed up by science. This could have a much more powerful effect if that is our goal. Okay, so there's one alternative, prevention. Here's another alternative. Let's look at life expectancy in a more global situation, and you see that it's a reasonably rosy picture if you live in North America or Europe. Okay, we are the most long-lived and highest quality of life generally peoples. But if you look at the rest of the globe, they fall well behind us. In fact, the green areas are like 10 or 15 years younger, and there's a whole lot of green. When you get into the yellows and reds, now you're getting really short life expectancy. Now, some of that is certainly due to political, climate, war, that sort of situation. But as highlighted by others, a lot of that is due to, well, let me just highlight it here. So this brings us back to that graph where you actually see this difference between the green and the blue line. This is the difference between developing countries, developing nations, and developed. And look, that's like almost 20 years of life expectancy. That's a major gap. Well, if we're thinking like humans, if we really want to increase human life expectancy and human quality of life, if that's the goal that we're trying to reach with animal research, well, here's another thing we could do, and it's something I associate with Bono Vox. He has made a big deal of saying that there are many issues happening in Africa, especially for Bono, but all over the world that are causing childhood mortality and all sorts of health issues that in North America we would have a simple way of dealing with it. Either it could be a vaccine, or it could be very simple drugs to cure infections and stuff like that. Basically, the story is if we just shared the innovations we had, so instead of putting a ton of money into that next innovation, if we use that money to share the innovations we had with the world, we could raise the life expectancy in developing countries by perhaps as much as 20 years, which would raise the human life expectancy in a global context much more than that. Okay, so here's another one, global dissemination. If that's our goal, increasing quality and duration of life, why don't we use prevention and global dissemination? It will have a much more powerful effect on that end game than will new research. Okay. All sounds good. What are the barriers? There's a couple of barriers. There's a number of barriers to this. A very important one is that indoctrination I just told you about. A systemic kind of thing we've created. And in fact, in the sciences, I don't know if you know what this is right off, but this is the Nobel Prize. This is what a scientist can earn by making a major scientific discovery. Okay? Curing diseases or making any major scientific discovery is sexy. It gets you cred in the scientific community. And this is the grandmother of all cred. Okay, if you get a Nobel Prize, you are as close to being a demigod in scientific circles as you can get. That's what our system kind of puts into the mentality of scientists from a very young age. It's about making that major discovery. Prevention, dissemination are not sexy. And by the way, they're also very hard to scientifically document the power of, unless you look at something like life expectancy over time. It's hard to do control groups of prevention. You just have to understand that it would work and employ it. But that's not a very sexy thing, and it won't win you a Nobel Prize. Okay, the Nobel Prize, that's the sort of top rung. But to a lower level, that's present anyway. In a different way. So here's a nice quote about philosophy. The best philosophers were not academics, but had another job. So their philosophy was not corrupted by careerism. This is true of every science. So in every science, careerism is a very powerful thing. We are judged by the numbers of papers we publish. That gives us our job to begin with. That gives us raises. That earns us grants. That makes us respected by our colleagues. Whoever has the biggest grant struts around the department like they are important. All of that, again, is focused on discoveries and papers. And it may not be Nobel Prize, but it's very much a currency that drives the science towards just publish anything, just get stuff out, do research. And it takes us away from the bigger picture of why we're doing the research to begin with. So I think this is a real obstacle. Okay, so I've suggested there's no justification for animal research, or at least the distinction between human and animal research ethics. I've suggested that there are at least a couple of alternatives that we could be pursuing right now that would have a major impact on our end goal. Am I saying we should just get rid of animal research? Well, I'm certainly not saying we should get rid of anything we learned from animal research in the past, and I'm also not saying we should get rid of animal research. But I'm saying we have to be respectful and, as close as we can, be equitable. So the science of the future that I imagine is one where we have one research code, one ethics code, that is applied to both humans and animals. We can no longer do anything to an animal that we would not do to a human. Now, there's always going to be one wrinkle in this. Humans can provide informed consent, animals cannot. But even that, I don't think is such a big deal. If we have some procedure that we know, generally speaking, humans consent to, then I think an animal who's in that same context, we could assume they could consent to it. It's not perfect, but otherwise, we could just have one equitable standard. Now, what does this mean? Well, this would mean that if you want to study cancer drugs in animals, you do it in a veterinary context. You wait for the animals who have cancer. And you might also wait for the humans who have cancer. We might get more aggressive in testing therapies on humans. We would not suggest that it has to go through the animals first. We would tell a human, hey, here's a process that we think might help, or a drug that we might think help. Here's why we think it might help. Do you want to try it or not? And so suddenly we're taking more risks with humans, the same level of risk we take with an animal. I actually think this could make science become less random. It could force people to have really good principled reasons for trying the things they're trying, and it could actually advance science. But it may not. And I'm willing to kind of take that risk because, as I suggested, I think we have to mature. And that maturity means becoming less egocentric and seeing ourselves as one life form among many. And that when it comes to research, when it comes to intentionally causing pain and suffering to others, We don't do anything to the animals that we wouldn't do to ourselves. We act consistently, we act maturely. We go from a very egocentric point of view to an ecocentric point of view, one where we see ourselves as one of many life forms. I see this as critical for well beyond the scientific context. I think this is the sort of maturity humans need if they are ever going to deal with the environmental issues on the planet and various other issues. We had a critical period in our history where we stopped seeing our planet as the center of the universe and started understanding the whole universe and how it interacted more accurately. We need to do the same in the sciences. And that's my claim to you. Right, so thank you very much. I assume there'll be some questions. This always causes a little bit of stirring up, so let's do it. Let's have some fun. All right? Thank you.